Tradable Mobile Emissions Rights System, TMERS, Strawman. For petrol cars, New Zealand is about to switch from petrol tax of 80 cents per litre, of about $2.50 petrol retail price, to a prepaid, distance-based road user charge system called RUC. Petrol cars will join diesel and electric vehicles that already pay RUC. RUC is purchased in 1,000 kilometer blocks at $77 plus admin per 1,000 kilometers, based on the car's odometer reading. It's an offense to drive with an odometer reading above the max dist recorder. New Zealand has an emissions trading scheme. It seeks to find the lowest marginal cost of emissions reduction across the whole economy. Fossil fuel transportation is so highly valued by households and organizations that current and forecast NZETS prices are not expected to cause abatement in light vehicle fleet emissions. Even worse, the switch to RUC will reduce petrol prices by 30%. This will reduce costs for high emissions vehicles, and that's going to cause emissions to rise, and there's nothing in place to offset this, nor to encourage ongoing reductions. To ensure international commitments are met, New Zealand needs to find a way to make transportation participate in emissions reduction. TMERS are tradable rights to buy RUC for fossil-fueled vehicles. Each right would represent 1 kilogram of emissions-related travel. Rights would be created for all allowed light vehicle emissions for the period. There'd be a sinking cap. The number of rights created would reduce each period. Rights would be allocated into individual accounts each period. Owners would use up rights when buying RUC. For example, for a petrol car rated at 234 grams of emissions per kilometer, the owner would use up 234 rights to buy 1,000 kilometers of RUC, in addition to paying the $77 plus admin. If you were short of rights when buying RUC, the owner would buy rights from the market. If having a surplus of rights, they could be gifted, sold privately, sold to the market, or saved.
Yep.
There are many configurable settings for TMERS. We needed to choose some settings to start a discussion. Much debate will be needed to arrive at a socially acceptable system that gets enough votes in a referendum. This strawman proposal includes the following settings. Initial rights creation matches the previous quarter's emissions. Quarterly reductions in the cap are fixed from day one. Quarterly allocations would be to all people who are 16 years of age and over for free. Allocations may be adjusted for equity based on need. There would be no allocations to organizations. The rights would not expire. Revenue from sales of surplus rights is not taxable. Regulated market makers buy and sell rights. Their margin is taxable. Market makers publish buy and sell prices. They must always have stock available. A New Zealand Transport Agency app would make it easy to manage and automate trading. Here are the expected impacts from implementing TMERS. There will be immediate market activity as EV owners and non-drivers will sell the rights that they don't need, and organizations will buy the rights that they need for their light vehicle fleet. People will become more aware of emissions from driving. People who think they might have a surplus will trade cautiously. As subsequent allocations reduce, people and organizations will explore options for maximizing surpluses or minimizing the quantity they need to buy. Organizations will electrify fleets quite quickly, while individuals will adjust their modes of travel more gradually. More shared trips will reduce traffic congestion. Individual interest in electric vehicles will increase, and the target level of emissions reduction will be achieved. Are there any clarifying questions about the straw man before we hear from our experts? Please mute yourself and raise your hand if you've got a question. Graham, go ahead.
Yes, it's not quite clear. You said that The initial allocation would be based on your historical usage. But what happens to someone who's only just acquired a car, or someone who...
I'll interrupt you, Graham. The initial allocation is based on the total emissions across the country.
Sorry, I thought you meant each individual.
Cool. I understand how you missed that. That's all right. Martin.
Just a quick one. You reported here that people 16 years old and older get these for free, certain amount. Does that mean you have to be citizens in the country, or how do you treat with strangers or visitors coming to your country?
Good question. I'm imagining that all citizens will. I imagine if you're a stranger coming to the country, you'll rent a car and the rental company will have purchased the rights. Graham.
Another question. In your run through, you said that organizations will not get an allocation. By organizations, do you mean commercial enterprises, companies?
Commercial enterprises, city councils, non-profits, they would not, no organization. It would only be to natural people, being people who can vote.
So does this mean those organizations would have to purchase them on the market that would presumably arise?
Absolutely correct. Thank you. Yes.
So the reason why economists have been working on instruments such as CO2 taxes, but also tradable permits for the management of emissions, has to do with the fact that we are facing what we call external cost. And external costs are defined as unpriced negative effects that agents impose upon others. So that can be local pollution, it can be noise, it can be accident risks if we talk about transport. Global warming is a very important one. And also traffic congestion, even though you might think that this is something that road users impose upon one another, the relevant level of analysis for an externality is the individual. And when I join a road, I'm slowing down others. So also that is an externality. And in fact, that was the externality that Arthur Pigou back in 1920, so we are here talking about economic theories of more than a century old. Traffic congestion was the example that he used in explaining why the market fails when we have externalities. Why, in case of external cost, there is overconsumption. And we talk about road transport today. So that would mean overconsumption of transport. And that is the first instance where tradable permits, in fact, are more flexible than traditional pricing of externalities. That is because the instrument, and Paul already hinted at it in the video, the instrument allows, through the initial distribution of permits, to really, in a very transparent way, address the fairness and the equity objectives that governments may have when dealing with externality. The distribution of permits gives a very strong instrument that allows the policymaker not only to deal with the efficiency aspect of the overconsumption of, well, CO2 emissions, but also to deal with the fairness of how that should be divided, that task of that aggregate task of reducing CO2 emissions. I give three examples, three classical ways of distributing these permits. The first is to put it in an auction, and then in fact you get very close to the pricing solution that Pigou had in mind. You may also decide, and that was what Paul has in mind, to give it to the initial emitters. And that will be a way to smoothen the burden of having to restrict the emissions. So there can be a politically very wise way of dealing with it. But for other externalities, you may also decide not to give it to the emitters, but to give it to the victims. Think of noise annoyance. And that will be a way to express that there is not a right for car drivers to emit noise, but there is a right for people to live in a quiet environment. So you can, as a government, really be very transparent about the fairness and the equity objectives that you have. So tradable permits maintain that attractive aspect of Pigouvian taxation. And the third one, that's the big disadvantage of Pigouvian taxation, and that's also why we see so little applications in reality, is that it leads to an increase in what we call generalized prices because optimal tolls are imposed. Driving becomes more expensive. And in fact, in the most simple textbook model, everybody except for the regulator would be worse off from the imposition of road pricing before the regulator uses the tax revenues and redistributes them. Now, I'm not an expert in political sciences, but I can tell you if you design a policy that makes everybody worse off except for the government, you will have little chance to have this accepted in a democracy. So that's the paradox of Pigouvian pricing. And also this can be considerably softened with tradable permits because the permits can be distributed beforehand for free. I think this initiative should be applauded for really trying to take this instrument to a practical application. There's also the comfort of having a solid body of economic research and also traffic engineering research looking at the ins and the outs of this instrument. So it is not that we are looking at something that is totally wild, totally new. There's already a lot of research going on. Overarching conclusions from these experimental studies looking at tradable permits is, first of all, participants understand and use the system as intended. So some of you may fear that the tax may have the disadvantages that I explained, but it's a lot simpler to understand. And tradable permits may sound like something that's very complicated. In fact, what turned out is that people very easily in a couple of weeks get used to the idea of using tradable permits, and then they use and understand the system as it is intended from theory. They also do so in a rational way. With that, I mean that the way that they deal and trade these permits shows that they understand exactly what they are doing. Now, finally, what about the straw man? Of course, after this introduction, you will not be surprised to hear that I find it a very interesting proposal and one that is consistent with much of what I've just said in favor of tradable permits. But we are here to discuss. So let me raise two, I think, interesting discussion points that we can address. First of all, is that there is already emissions trading of CO2 in New Zealand. And that raises the question, what is it that justifies or that requires, on top of existing emissions trading, a higher CO2 price in road transport than in other realms of economic behavior? Why should we have a different CO2 price from some activities, namely road transport, than in other activities? I think that is something to be addressed because that is something where you would really need to have your defense in order if you want to sell this idea, so to speak. Looking at the clock, I'm worried that I took more than I got. And that's because you should have made speaking time tradable.
So here we can see that is the figure about the departure time distribution in month 0. So that is the before the experiment. And the month 2 is after all these treatments. So here we can see the green line is the control group, and all the other lines is the incentives group. So based compared to the control group, we can see for the treatment group, their number of rush hour trips significantly decreased, and the distribution of their departure times has a higher variance. So we can see their peak now is moved earlier, so towards the shorter peak. The tradable permits has a statistically significant effect on travelers' peak avoidance behavior. So that means the tradable permits, yes, they decrease the number of points they use, so decrease the peak trips in our experiment. So most people said that they think the tradable permits are more acceptable than the congestion charge. So here is the brief conclusion of this case study. So we found that tradable permits works well in the road rush hour traffic conducted. It can affect the free market outcome to better reflect scarcity. That is what we want, and improve users' activity level. So improve their engagement in the permit market is a very important way to enhance the effect of tradable permits. So if they can trade more actively, the permits can be more effectively, even more than the congestion charge. And in the long run, the effectiveness of tradable permit may even better when travelers are familiar with the tradable permit scheme. And for most participants, permits are more acceptable than the congestion charge.
It matches, in fact, insights that we have from road pricing applications, that acceptance increases after implementation of the system. And it has been recorded in London, in Stockholm. And it has to do with the fact that also the opponents of this sort of measure are very successful in making voters and citizens believe that the instrument is just meant, to get your money, and you will be paying money and you will still be stuck in traffic. And of course, there are many arguments against that, but the best way to overcome that type of resistance is to demonstrate. And that is, I think, also what we see at a very small scale in our experiment, where indeed the acceptance increases over time. I agree with what you say. It is important to keep in mind, though, that of course the road pricing system allows one to redistribute the revenues. The point is that even though that can be the case, and even though you can, try to convince people that it's true, that it leads to an increase in social welfare if you do this, the resistance is enormous. And I think the one of the things that makes tradable permits more acceptable to voters and to the public at large is the fact that it's built in the system that the revenues will indeed be redistributed upfront by handing out these permits. So the fact, you can wonder, why is it that people consistently vote against policies that would increase social welfare? It's an important question. And I think good economy and good economists would ask that question, would not say people don't get it right, they're stupid. No, you should wonder, why is it that people don't believe that? And there is, at least, let me speak for the Netherlands, an important reason that people simply distrust governments to use the revenues in a way that will benefit them. And one of the strong points of tradable permits is that you make you make immediately clear how the revenues will be redistributed. And I think the mechanisms of, for instance, why in the EU we see emissions trading for firms, and why the EU succeeded to have that and not CO2 pricing, I think it's the same sort of mechanism. And time is becoming more pressing to think about what is it, to think more carefully about what is it in road pricing, in the pricing of externalities that people dislike, and what can we do in order to overcome that. And of course, we are here to discuss CO2 permits. And that is an issue that's becoming more and more urgent. So if we wait for the people to embrace road pricing, it may be too late. Yeah, so my understanding is that with the RUC, you also already have in place that there is, between quotation marks, official checking of the odometers to check on the total mileage or kilometrage that is being driven. So you already have a lot in place, I think, to make an experiment where you, Kushin is modest and says a small sample size. I'm greedy, so a somewhat bigger sample size, because that's, good for the experiment. And also, if you want to really identify how does this instrument work out differently for different income classes, depending on, spatial aspects, where do people live, where do they work? There are a lot of questions and a lot of possible concerns that you could address. But the fact that you already have the measurement of the behavior that you want to affect in place, that really simplifies, I think, the execution of the project. Knowing that with an experiment, you can only have short-run responses, right? People will not change cars. Those are the responses that you would have in the longer run, and you can't get them in a small experiment or in a experiment of a couple of months or whatever. But the short-run behavioral impacts are already interesting. I think you could, just do that in the same way as that we have been doing the congestion charging experiment in Beijing. You don't need a lot. You need a research budget. You need a budget to make sure that people who are now supposed to be voluntarily part of something that later on will not be voluntarily. But now, of course, you need money to convince people to be part of the experiment. So you would need a research budget, but it's not a spectacularly big research budget, so I think it can be done. And we as economists cannot say what is fair. That is a political matter. So there are all sorts of questions underlying this tradable permit system that you could also address in such an experiment. And if you couple it with questionnaires where you ask people's perceptions, ideas about what is fair, I think there's a lot of information that you could get. But